Hello there, my name is Daniel Backer and this is my son Lawrence. Today I'm going to recommend an author to you that really blew my mind, or I should say, who really blew my mind. When I first started reading him a couple of years ago, it got me out of a reading rut. But before that, you might notice I have kind of bloodshot eyes. I just went to a hot yoga class. I got a membership there maybe a month and a half ago. And I'll have you know that I can touch my toes now with straight legs, which is a huge improvement to where I was before. So I'll probably be enlightened here before too long. But let's get into it. This author that I found, his name is Antoine Volodine, but that's actually just a pseudonym that he writes under. He writes actually under a couple different pseudonyms. There's also Lutz Bassman, and Manuela Draeger is another one of these pseudonyms, so that already I think should get you going. But this is a really interesting guy because he's developed this genre of literature that did not exist beforehand that he calls post-exoticism. And just hearing that name is what actually got me interested in this, because I got recommended on Amazon this book right here. If you can see that, there you go. It's called Post-exoticism in 10 Lessons, Lesson 11. So just that title alone, I was like, okay, I got to see what this is. And to be honest, I couldn't really tell from the title if it was a book of fiction or if it was like a technical writing book or like a theory book, because it does sound like some sort of explanation of a new wave of literature. And truth be told, it's kind of both. This one is anyway. So it is kind of technical sounding, but it still functions as a work of fiction. So just to kind of break down that title, what I take from that, Post-exoticism in 10 Lessons, Lesson 11, is that they go through, or Antoine Volodine goes through different things that make a work post-exotic, but then the book itself is also considered a post-exotic work. So let's try to explain technically what that means. So to him, based on what I have gathered from these books, is that a post-exotic work is basically something that has been written by somebody in a post-apocalyptic society after communism has started to rise again and capitalism has fallen. Although I think in some of the books they talk about how capitalism is rising again. But before you get turned off by the idea of the post-apocalyptic genre, I will just say it doesn't really feel like any other post-apocalyptic thing that you might have read before. Personally, I'm not necessarily into those stories. I'm sure you could show me one that's pretty good. I never read The Road by Cormac McCarthy, but I saw the movie and I thought it was pretty good. But yeah, it's just not necessarily a genre that I really seek out. And so I've talked to other people too who do read a lot of post-apocalyptic fiction, and they corroborate that this is not your daddy's post-apocalyptic work. This is a post-exotic work, like I said. So again, what makes a post-exotic work, at least according to these books, is that it's written after society has fallen, but a lot of the elements in these books end up dealing with this concept called the bardo. And if you've ever read anything referring to the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the bardo is considered this in-between life and death. And so a lot of the characters end up talking about how they have died and they're still kind of just going about their business. So this is kind of a fun thing that death does not necessarily stop these characters. They'll die, but they're still required to be a part of the story, and they kind of continue their arc anyway. So that was something that I read that just really blew my mind when I was reading it. And I had never seen anything quite like that. However, once I say that, I'm thinking of Half-Life from Philip K. Dick. Or if you've ever read the book Ubik before, spoiler alert, it deals with that concept of kind of being half alive, half dead, and not really being able to tell definitively one or the other, and then also this kind of concept of it not really mattering, that they're kind of dead, they're kind of alive, but yeah, they have to kind of keep on going anyway. So Another really fascinating part of these books is that they deal with a lot of shamanism, that there are these sort of magical elements that I think you don't necessarily usually associate with something that's sort of dealing with politics. And it doesn't get into the politics of anything too specifically. It's more of just these forces that sort of play. They're almost treated like magical forces in and of themselves. And one of the books in particular, which I consider one of the best ones of this sort of post-exotic series, is this book called Radiant Terminus. So this one is bonkers. And the segue kind of had to do with communism, so I'll start by talking about that, but I'll talk more about Radiant Terminus here in a second. Basically, they have this commune that's led by a guy named Soloviev, I believe. And he's a communist that's basically in charge of this commune. But what's interesting is they get into this idea about how ideology in general can sort of work like a magical spell over people. And so he's a communist, yes, but he's also a shaman who can trap people inside of these dream worlds. And similar to not being able to tell if you're alive or dead or not, these characters also can't really tell if they're trapped inside of a dream world or not. And so there's all of these really cool moments when people think that they've escaped from the commune, but then they'll hear him laugh or they'll hear him whistle in their head, and they'll realize, oh no, we're still in Soloviev's grasp. He's still inside of us. And I've never really seen anything done like that before. I'm sure there's examples of it out there, but that was something that I thought was a really cool way of addressing a political point without necessarily getting into long-winded historical references or hyper-technical theory about these ideologies. Now, I don't think you necessarily have to be communist or capitalist-leaning in order to enjoy these books, because kind of like he doesn't make a strong stance on whether or not these characters are alive or dead or whether or not they're trapped in a dream world, he also doesn't really make a strong stance about what is better, communism or capitalism. He almost looks at them as these two sides of the same coin, that they're just these fragile human ways of structuring society that ultimately lead to this post-exotic environment. So another really cool thing about these books is that they tend to refer to each other to a certain extent. And so Lutz Bossman is the author of this book, and this one I actually haven't read yet, but it's called We Monks and Soldiers, and he is also a character that appears in Radiant Terminus. Lutz Bossman is. Let me double check to make sure I'm not completely making that up, but if it's not that, it's some of the characters end up coming back and forth in the other books. Minor Angels is another one of these books, and they end up talking about minor angels in this post-exoticism in 10 Lessons, Lesson 11. And so, yeah, you do get a good sense that he's sort of fleshed out this literary genre for himself, and it sort of rewards you for reading more of the books, because you end up kind of feeling like he's winking at you to a certain extent every time that they make a reference. But since I brought up this book, Minor Angels, this is one that is really interesting and also pretty easy to read. So if I could show it to you, every chapter is only like 2 or 3 pages long. I'm having a lot of trouble doing this. So we've got like, it starts there, we get a full 2 pages of text, and then it's over, and it moves on to the next one. And some of them don't even fill up a full page. So this is one that you can flip through pretty quickly. And according to the back of this, it says that it's not something you're necessarily supposed to understand, but in your dreams afterward, it'll make sense. And I think that's a little bit overblown. There's still a lot you can take from Minor Angels without having to go to bed and then dream about it afterward. But one of the things that I remember most about reading Minor Angels is that they have this, similar to the fact that Post-exoticism in 10 Lessons, Lesson 11 is sort of an example of itself, that he's explaining to you what post-exoticism is, and then it is also an example of post-exoticism. Minor Angels is divided up into those chapters that each follow a certain character around. But then in one of the stories, there's this man who's made out of lint, and he was made by these old grandmas, and they tie him to a tree and point guns at him until he spontaneously starts telling these stories. And sort of as you read it, this might be a spoiler, but I'm trying to get you guys to read this book. As you read it, you start to discover that the stories that he's spontaneously speaking into the air are the stories that you're reading. And so it's got this really interesting circular effect that I guess would be sort of an example of metafiction, but it's not nearly as heady as a lot of metafiction. It feels very effective and much more mind-bending than purely technical. Or if you guys have ever read Lost in the Funhouse, that's a good example of metafiction, but that sort of feels, yeah, a little bit more technical, a little bit more, maybe you could even say arrogant a little bit. This one doesn't seem quite as arrogant. And then even Post-exoticism and 10 Lessons, Lesson 11, that seems like it would be this really technical book. It's really not. It's a pretty easy read. He's not using a lot of big words, and I would say that's probably true for most of these. He does make some references to some different Russian words at various points, and so it can help to look those up. But for the most part, it's pretty easy to understand. He's not building these scenes where you're just like, what is going on here, and having to reread the paragraph. You can get through them pretty quickly. And this one, for example, is... Sorry about that, Lawrence. This one is like 93 pages long, and a lot of it is like lists. You know, so it's definitely not a conventional narrative, which is pretty fun, especially this one. And yeah, it's just a much different approach to reading in general. And I think that this is something that sort of, yeah, got me out of a reading rut for a while, because I got really into some experimental fiction in college, and the effect of reading a lot of experimental fiction is that you read a lot of it and it's like amazing, and it cracks your egg. It is just the coolest thing, and then it kind of ruins reading for you for a while, that you start to look out for other cool things and you don't want to go back to a conventional narrative. And so after you sort of absorb a lot of that, yeah, you can get in kind of a rut after that. And so this is somebody that took me out of a rut. Now, like I said, I was reading a lot of Antoine Volodine a couple of years ago, and so nowadays I am actually a little bit more interested in a conventional narrative. How I got out of the experimental fiction rut was I started reading a lot of detective books. That is, yeah, they're just a little bit more straightforward. They're not playing with the form quite as much, but let me see if there's anything more that I can say about these. A little bit more about Radiant Terminus is, and I guess this is true for a lot of these, is that he really, and I've noticed that a lot of more experimental fiction and metafiction, they really elevate reading to this very important thing. And so, as this story takes place, there will be different paragraphs that talk about how different writers within the world captured this in various literary forms. One of those forms is called a romance. Another one is called a narract. A narract, I think I'm saying it right. And I don't remember off the top of my head exactly what these are, but it's basically, yeah, these different literary forms that fit into the post-exotic canon. And so, yeah, it's a little bit of this intertextuality, some of which doesn't even refer to a book that's out yet. Now, I have seen online that there are some books of his that are in this world that don't necessarily exist in English yet. So we definitely still have a lot more to look forward to that's already published in the original French, and I'm sure that he is continuing to write because he's been pretty prolific so far. So I think in particular this one was published by a publishing house called Open Letter Books, and I have a couple more on the shelf from Open Letter that I haven't read yet, but it definitely seems like they are publishing some really weird off-the-wall stuff that's like kind of literary and kind of science fiction-y at the same time, which I think is really fun. Nothing against straight genre fiction or anything like that, but I think a common complaint with literary fiction is that it's super boring, and a common complaint with genre fiction is that sometimes there's not as much formal fireworks going on. They're not playing with yeah, style necessarily. I'm sure people are going to get mad at that, but I think that what's nice about open letter books, at least as far as I can tell based on these synopses and some of these books right here, is that they have a lot of books that are both formally interesting and experimental, and also, yeah, a little bit more nodding toward genre, a little bit more interesting than just a day in the life of a writer. Those are my least favorite books, and so I don't really read them, is that, like, this book is about a writer who is just dealing with his problems. It's like, oh, okay. I read books in order to escape into an interesting world, not in order to just read about the author. So there you go, guys. I hope that you will check out Antoine Volodine. Like I said, he is a super cool dude. Let me just show you some of these other ones. This is another one that I haven't read yet. It's called Writers, and so this, I'm sure, gets more into the actual post-exotic writers in his world that he is writing about. And then this is another one that I haven't read yet called Bardo or Not Bardo. So I am eager to get into that here before too long. I'm still reading Warlock right now, and so I might jump back into one of these in a while. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Please like and subscribe. Give me any comments if you are interested or if you have any questions. Oh, I also forgot to mention this. In Radiant Terminus, the main bad guy, Soloviev, the communist leader, he can turn into a bird at a few times. And so that was Lawrence's favorite part of the book. Isn't that right? Isn't that right? Alrighty, guys. Thanks for stopping by. Hopefully, if you read this author, you will... I don't know why this is so hard. Write better stories. Okay, goodbye.